Hello everyone, I'm J.D. Seal and Vice President at SkyView Partners, and I want to welcome you to today's session on implementing security best practices for the IBMI. Today's host is Carol Woodbury, President of SkyView Partners. Here at SkyView Partners, we're committed to delivering products and services that not only provide our customers with sound advice, but also saves them time, reduces the costs, and simplifies the management of security administration, including compliance. Today's speaker, Carol Woodbury, is the co-founder, president, and CTO of SkyView Partners. Prior to forming SkyView, Carol spent 16 years at IBM in positions including Chief Engineering Manager and Security Architect for IBM's iSeries Security Group. Carol is also the author of the new book, IBMI Security Administration and Compliance, and you will receive a link to that if you want to order on MC Press in the email you should get after the webinar. So with that, I want to introduce Carol Woodbury and today's session on implementing security best practices for the IBMI. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. Carol?
Hi JD, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Implementing best practices is a question that I get quite often. How does one do that efficiently and effectively? So I just wanted to talk about what constitutes best practices first. And if anybody wants to follow me, I just want to point out, if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, I commit to not telling people what I had for lunch, but you may see a bit of my personality come out in the Twitters, and I promise that I will tweet at least one security tip a week. So there we go. So one question that I often get about security best practices is, where do you find the resources that tell you what security best practices actually are? So I thought I'd just go through that just briefly. There are ISO standards that have developed over the years that pertains very specifically to security, and they're in this 27,000 series. So that's one of the places that you can go for security best practices, is the ISO standards. Another place that you can go is COBIT. Now COBIT is not necessarily a standard, but it is a process by which you analyze risk across IT. And it is meant in its purest form to be a set of processes that you follow religiously. The whole COBIT process is fairly involved and fairly lengthy, and for small organizations it would be too overwhelming. However, even for small businesses, there are a lot of things that you can take away just by reading the COBIT standards. It will remind you, in a lot of cases, about some of the processes or some of the steps that you might want to take. So, for example, they'll talk about change management and the different processes that you should go through, from development of code into promoting it into production. And so you can think through the various steps that your organization takes and decide whether or not you need to add any steps by just simply reading this document. And they have just come up with an updated COBIT document, so that was out within the last month, and that is available from the ISACA organization. If you want to look at a vertical industry that espouses security best practices, the best way to look at that is through the payment card industry, and that's through the data security standards. Now, is it 100%, or are all of these 100% coverage? The answer is no, but again, you can get a lot of good direction from reading the standard. Even if you do not process credit cards or store credit cards, this is a good source of information for security best practices. And by far, it's the one that provides the most actual details. So a lot of these laws and regulations, if you look at HIPAA, the healthcare information, and high tech that goes with it, you'll see that there is a lot of guidance, but not necessarily hard and fast recommendations, and that's what the payment card industry data security standards does for you. So throughout all of these things, having read all of these and sort of processed them, I have written the book IBM I Security Administration and Compliance. So between that and the I-Series Security Reference Manual that's available from IBM, those are the two places that you can go that translate all of these industry standard best practices into terms that apply to the IBM I. And so that's how our recommendations are derived. So the place that manifests itself within the SkyView product line is in Risk Assessor. And Risk Assessor, this is kind of an eye chart here, but Risk Assessor is a product that will examine the current settings on your system, and you can see this is an eye chart because the product is so broad. It goes across all of i5OS and examines the current settings and compares those to security best practices. So that's your best source of knowing what your system looks like as compared to security best practices. Now when you run Risk Assessor, it produces a document that looks like this. So the middle document that you see there is the main document, and the surrounding documents are the supplemental reports. So both within the main document as well as the details, you will get information on the specifics of what's being examined. Now also in that main document are examples of things that you should consider before you change from the current setting into a different setting. It also explains why a particular aspect of the operating system is being examined. So in the user section, it examines and the public authority setting, for example, of user profiles, and there's an explanation as to why it's being examined and why it might be a risk to your organization. So these are this is an excellent resource for you to understand where your system is in comparison to best practices. We actually have a service that will go through these reports for you that you've run on your system, and it will produce a report that we go over with you, and it lists the items in high, medium, and low risk sections so that you can make a choice as to which item you address first. But the point here is that it gives Risk Assessor, the descriptions are there to describe why something constitutes best practices and why it's being examined on your system. Now, some of the things that when we just look at what pertains to security best practices when it pertains to IBM I, certainly one of the things that you have to consider, and probably the first thing to consider, are your system value settings. So there's a whole section on system values, what the best practices are, and considerations before changing. Certainly the things that you really have to pay attention to are your security level. So best practices says that you are running your systems at either security level 40 or 50, and you're certainly not at best practices if you don't. Password rules, we'll talk about some password rules when we look at PolicyMinder, and also that auditing needs to be started and configured properly to audit the appropriate things. And so the list of our minimum recommended set of auditing requirements is also listed in Risk Assessor. So after you consider the global settings or setting the tone of security across your system using the system values, the next thing that you probably consider are how your user profiles are configured. And when you look at security best practices, there's a handful of things that pop out. One thing is that there shouldn't be any default passwords on the system. Another thing is that inactive users need to be set to a status of disabled and or removed from the system. So we're going to show you how you can use PolicyMinder to do those things, as well as analyze who has a particular special authority and discovering any profiles that have it now that didn't used to have it, as well as things like members of a group and making sure that they're all configured correctly. This is very easy to do within PolicyMinder, and I'll show you how you can configure these things that will help you with your administration tasks. It will help you implement security best practices as well as keep you in compliance with security best practices. Now, once you've analyze the system values and user profile settings, the other thing and the other aspect of IBM iSecurity is how you have configured the authority to various objects. So again, from a security best practices point of view, any data file or directory that contains confidential information or private information should be set to public authority of exclude, or the term in best practices is called deny by default. So if you see that in the documentation that I listed earlier, you would see it noted as deny by default. So you definitely want to keep track of those specific files, making sure that they're secured appropriately. So that's the default access for public. Now there may be other files that don't need to be denied by default but should be set to read-only access, just to make sure that the integrity of the data is assured, and that can be done when the public authority is read. There may be additional private authorities or authorization lists that are assigned to certain files. Again, those all need to be reviewed, and again, it's very easy with this product called PolicyMinder. So I've referred to it, so what is it? PolicyMinder for IBM I, we also have PolicyMinder for AIX, by the way, is a product that allows you to define and document what your policies are. Now we started out talking about security best practices, and we're going to continue that, but I've never actually seen a system in production that has totally been set or is able to be set to security best practices. Either there is a vendor application that prevents it, or there's been configuration in the past with default passwords and they're hard-coded that perhaps it's just too difficult and the business has taken the choice to not eliminate those. Whatever it is, there's exceptions. So PolicyMinder allows you to document those exceptions from best practices. Then you can perform what we call a compliance check, which is simply a method of examining the policy that you've defined within PolicyMinder, so what the settings are supposed to be, and compare that against what the system is actually configured to be. And then you can use PolicyMinder to fix the issues. So if you find that the public authority setting of a file has been changed, you can use PolicyMinder to change that back, for instance. So the purpose of PolicyMinder is to automate your security policy compliance checking to help you reduce the time and effort that it takes for you to stay in compliance. And for those of you who have seen me talk before, compliance, like security, is not to be a one-time event. And security best practices, if you set it to security best practices once, your system is certainly not going to stay that way. It will gradually, and maybe not so gradually, go out of compliance from those security best practices settings. So you have to develop what I call to be a compliance lifestyle. So it's not just one particular race that you run, it's a lifestyle that you do on a regular basis. So with that said, let's go and look at the PolicyMinder product itself. Okay, so this is the main menu of PolicyMinder, and I'll show you the GUI version in just a bit. So the first thing that we talked about in my little slideshow was system values. So there's a couple things that you can do with system values. Now if you already have your system values set the way that you want them, one thing that you can do is initialize those. Remember, the idea with PolicyMinder is to save you time. So if you have already gotten your system values the way that you want them, you can simply go in and initialize the system values. In fact, you can initialize all of these categories that I'm looking at right now. And this is a very fast process. Basically, all this is doing is going out and getting the current settings for all of your system values and bringing them in to the product and establishing that as your policy. So right now we're just gathering up all the current settings for our system values. All right, now when we do this, we can go back into the policies. And so you can see I just took option 1 off the main menu, work with policies. So these are all of the various categories that you can cover within PolicyMinder. I'm going to drop into the system value category. You can see they're subdivided, and so let's go into the passwords. And let's go into the password expiration interval. So you can see that the policy is 90. So I'm going to pop up a command line here, and I'm going to work with the password system values. So best practices does say that your password expiration interval should be 90 days. So that's set at best practices, but what happens if that gets changed? So what happens if this value somehow gets changed to no max? All right, you would definitely want to know about that. Now let's take a look at some of the other system values. Let's take a look at the minimum length. Minimum length, current best practices says 7, but it's actually a lot of the documentation is starting to move towards a minimum length of 8. So we're going to move that to 8. Okay, anything else? Oh, require a digit. Yes, usually they require a digit. So those are some of the security best practices settings. So let's go back now and let's run what we call a compliance check. And I'm going to do this interactively. I can also do this through a command, which is what you would typically do. Once you get the product configured, you will put the check command in a job scheduler and have these reports run on a regular basis. So I'll show you that in just a moment. But we're going to run a check on the system values right now. So that's run, and you can see that the compliance status now says next level. So if I drill down into this category for the system values, you can see that the password system value is set to next level. So I'm going to go down, and lo and behold, it is out of compliance because remember we just changed this value to be no max from 90. So obviously the password system value itself is not correct. So what I want to do at this point in time is run what we call fix-it. Now what fix-it is going to do is actually change the system value on the system. So I'm just going to back out of here and run fix-it. All right, so now the system value has changed. So let's just prove that. Display sysval, qpwd.exp.itv. And yes, it's back to being 90. That's what we want it to be. Now we have that other system value that we changed. Remember, we went in and we changed the minimum length. So perhaps you're in this situation where you have some system values, you know that they're not set to security best practices, and over the next few months or perhaps after one of our security checkups, you realize that maybe you better change a system value. So what you can do is go in and say F17 to accept, and this will actually update my policy. So now my policy has been updated and the policy now matches the actual value of the system value. So this is just a real quick showing of what you can do with PolicyMinder. So that's an example for the system values. Let's take a look at user profiles. We said that there were several things that you needed to manage from a best practices point of view for at the user profile level. So let's take a look, and what you're seeing in the screen are these things called a template. And all a template is simply a way to tell PolicyMinder which profiles you want to have examined during a compliance check and what attributes you're going to look at. So let's create a new template. So I'm going to create a template called Enact 90, and that's because I'm going to use this template to find my profiles that are inactive 90 days, and I'm going to use Fix-It to take action on those. So I'm going to put a description in here, inactive profiles disable. Okay. Now when we choose which profiles we're going to look at using one of these templates, we can do that using a number of different criteria. So I've put my cursor on the type field. I'm pressing F4, and you can see all of the different ways that we can select user profiles. So we can do that by user profile name, which could be a generic. We could do it by accounting code, the number of days inactive, the members of a particular group, limited capability setting, special authorities, and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways to select which profiles to look at. We're going to look at them based on the number of days inactive. So I'm going to include, this IO is include and omit, and I want to look at profiles inactive 90 days. Now the interesting thing with this analysis is that when you start looking at inactive profiles, and if you've done this at all, you know that there are some profiles that need to be omitted because they look inactive, but you would not want to take action on them. So things like perhaps the IBM profiles, things like all of my group profiles perhaps, and profiles that own objects, right? So that's a profile that owns the SkyView product. Can put those out there. So I'm going to, when a compliance check is run, what I'm going to do is look at all of the profiles that are inactive, and we look at the last use date. If that's blank, we look at the creation date and the restore date. So we're not looking at a profile that was created last week, but just hasn't been signed on with yet or used yet. So we're looking at inactive profiles 90 days or more, but we're going to omit any of the group profiles, all the Q profiles, and all the SkyView owned profiles. Now the reason we're doing this, number one, it's security best practices to, and this comes directly out of PCI, to either set profiles to be disabled so that they can't be used for sign-on, or to remove the profiles after a period of 90 days of inactivity. Now you may need to do another time period. We were working with some people in the UK. They have different laws and regulations there, so that their time period for inactivity has to be substantially longer than if you are in the US. So there's different requirements. 90 days is not a magic number, but in the US that's typically security best practices. So we're going to scroll down, and what I really want to do with this is automate my process so that I don't have to worry about my profile sitting out there being able to be used. So what I'm going to do is specify the status field and say disabled. So when the inactive profiles are examined, I could be looking at all of these other attributes of the user profile as well. But I'm focusing in on the fact that I want these profiles to be status of disabled. So I'm going to create this template. All right, and I've done that. And so now I'm going to go and run a compliance check. Now, before I do that, however, I'm going to do two things. Number one, I'm going to add a policy description. And this is a great place, again, from a best practices point of view. You may need to document certain things that you've done that can't be in compliance. So when an auditor sees this report, they might ask, well, why are these profiles omitted? So you can document this right in here. Profiles omitted are IBM or vendor profiles that own the application, or our group profiles. Okay. Now this is going to print out when I print the policy, and I'll do that in just a minute. Okay, so there I've documented my exceptions. So the other thing that I'm going to do is enable Fix-It. So Fix-It by default is not active, so I want to activate that for this particular template. Okay, so now I'm going to go and I'm going to run a compliance check, and this time I'm going to use a compliance check command, and I can do this on a specific category and the template that I just created. Now the thing about this is that I can actually email myself the results. So again, if you're thinking of an automation process for this, you would put this command in your job scheduler, and you can have a couple options here. You can always email yourself the report, but you may also want to say that I only want to see this report if there are non-compliant items. So I can say and schedule it so that it will only send me a report when there are non-compliant items. So then I can send this to myself, or I can send it to support, or I can send it to whatever email that I want to. Okay, I can actually add up to 10 email addresses there. So now this is running. It's looking for any profiles not active for the last 90 days, omitting the profiles that start with the letter Q, and group profiles, and the SkyView own profile. Okay, so now it's generating the PDF. You can also send a compliance check and have it go to an out file or to a CSV and open it in Excel. Okay, so one of the things that you can do as well from an automation point of view, if you have some sort of message management software, if everything is compliant, you get one message. If things are not compliant, so in this case that would mean that there's inactive profiles that are not set to status of disabled. You could monitor for that message and take one action if everything is compliant and a different action if they aren't. So let's take a look at what this has produced. So this compliance check looks like this. So this is a list of all of the profiles that are inactive 90 days or more. So you can see that some of them are compliant and some are not. So if I take a look at one of the compliant ones, there's going to be nothing highlighted here. You can see that the policy, which is always on your left, will be defined, and the current settings for those profiles are included. So it is already set at a status of disabled. Now the easiest thing to do here is to use the option to subset the view and to only look at my non-compliant items. So here are the profiles that I really want to take a look at. Now if I go through this list and I see one of these that I think, oh wait a minute, that one's okay to be inactive, that is a candidate for omitting that profile from the template. The goal here is to get down to the profiles that you really want to take action on so that you can automate this process. If you are currently going through a process yourself, a manual process, and think, oh no, that one's okay, this one's okay, this one's okay, you can easily define that process within PolicyMinder and just always know that the result is something that you have to take action on. Okay, so these are the non-compliant ones. If I go and display this, you can see that the status is supposed to be disabled, but it's set to enabled. So what I would do from a automation point of view is to schedule the command called fixit. All right, so you schedule the command called check, and then you can schedule the command called fixit. So fixit, again, you specify what you want to look at. And if you are not comfortable running fixit right away, one of the things that we offer is this fixit in test mode. I'm just going to run that. This is going to tell you what will change but doesn't actually make the change. Okay, so we've got a report on that. So there's a couple different ways that you can look at this. You can either look at the fixit report. You can also look at this thing called a message log, which allows you to, it's a flight recorder of the actions within PolicyMinder. So I can take a look at this, and this will tell me the exact command string that would be used. Again, from a best practices point of view, change management is critical. So changes that are going to happen on your system need to be documented. So it may not be an automated process that you would use this fix-it report for. But a fix-it in test mode, we have a number of our customers that use the fix-it in test mode to document what's going to be changed on a particular date, especially when it's object authorities. So they'll use that report as part of their change management request, and it documents exactly what will be changed. Okay, so that's fix-it. Now let me show you a couple other things in user profiles, and then we're going to move on to libraries and directories. So I'm going back into the user profile policies. Now a couple other things that we talked about was looking at which profiles have special authorities and monitoring profiles that now have that special authority that didn't have it before. So I'm going to go in this template called All Object. Now in this case, what I want to do is to look for anybody that has All Object directly assigned to their profile or are a member of a group that has All Object. So in this case, anybody that's a member of QSEC Offer. And what I'm going to do is take advantage of this attribute called New Profile Allowed. And instead of leaving it at the default of yes, I've changed it to be no. And that's the only thing I'm going to look for in this template. So I'm not going to specify any attributes to examine. So what happens when you first run the very first compliance check against this template, it lists all of the profiles that either have All Object assigned or are a member of QSEC Offer. So you can simply just get the list just by running that compliance check. And so here's that list, all right? And a lot of times, that first time you run this report, you will often see profiles that you think, why are they a member of QSEC Offer, or why do they have All Object? They shouldn't have that. So even that first run is useful. But what is also useful after that, and again takes away a lot of the hand comparisons that I've seen a lot of people do, is the next time a profile is either created to have All Object or is changed to have All Object or become a member of QSEC Offer, we'll just call this QSEC member. I'm going to make sure it doesn't have a password here. And group profile QSEC Offer. So the next time I create that profile, and now when I run a compliance check on that, it's going to identify that profile because it was not in the list the first time. So it wasn't in what we call a baseline. All right, so when we take a look at that, let me call it, say, that QSEC member, you can see it's out of compliance because it's new. So you can do a couple things with this. If this is truly perhaps a new administrator, you may want to do something called accept new. And basically that's just going to add that profile into your baseline of profiles that have All Object. And so you can look at that list to see who has All Object, and that would now be included, and it's not going to be out of compliance anymore. But perhaps that's a profile that has been given a member of QSEC Offer for an upgrade test or an upgrade process and needs to be removed. This is a good trigger and a warning for you to remove that. Again, security best practices says that you want to limit the number of profiles that have All Object, or in this case are a member of QSEC Offer, because you want to limit the capabilities that you're giving to people and only give them those capabilities that they need to do their job. And that's obviously the administrators when you're talking All Object. So this is another case of being able to implement security best practices. Now a couple other things with user profiles, you can do things like look at all of the members of a particular group profile. And you can say that those members, in this case the members are supergroup, need to be configured in a specific way. So it could be the user class. You could specify, you could say that the special authorities are supposed to be no special authorities. They're supposed to be initial menu of sign-off, limited capabilities, yes, no default passwords, and so forth. And when you run a compliance check on this, it will pull in all of the members of supergroup, and it will analyze their attributes and call out any of the profiles that don't match this criteria that we've just defined. Then if you want, you can run fixit, and it would actually change those profiles to match what you've just defined. So there's a number of ways that you can use PolicyMinder for the users to make sure that you are following security best practices and automating that process, no less. Now let's look at the GUI portion of this. The GUI portion of PolicyMinder is simply an instance of the Apache web server, so I'm looking at this in my browser. I've signed on to this GUI view with my normal iSeries IBM I user ID and password. And the first thing I see are the systems that I want to manage from this view. And so if you have multiple systems, this is a very easy way to do this. I can just click on the system name and go to that system and see what the issues are. So you can see that I've got compliance issues on each one of these systems. But we can either use the GUI view or the green screen view, or you can mix the view. It doesn't matter. You can mix and match, if you will, because if we click on the system that we've been working on and we look at the user profile settings, you can see that these are the same templates that we were working with in the green screen version. So it's the same database, so it doesn't matter how you want to work with it, it's all there. So here's that inactive 90 that we created. So I just clicked on the template name, and here's where we had entered that description, that additional description. And here's where we had said which user profiles we want to look at and omit. The policies, meaning what did we want to be examined, which in this case was the status. And once you run a compliance check, this fourth tab is going to appear, and it will list the profiles that are in and out of compliance. Again, you can look at just the non-compliant items. And when you do, again, you can just look at the details, and you can see that it's enabled, it's supposed to be disabled, and again, you can run fixit if you want to, which would actually change the status to be disabled. And so now that's out of, it's in compliance, so it's out of the view that we were looking at. Okay, so either view works. So let's go to the library settings. Now again, one of the things that we were talking about was to make sure that settings on specific files didn't change, and that it would depend on what those settings were depending on the type of data. So if you're talking about private data, security best practices says that that database file needs to be set to public exclude, and only the users authorized or that have a job function to access that file should be directly accessing the file, and therefore those are the only users that should have authority to them. So you can look at files and data areas and programs and whatever objects you want to, again, by creating this thing called a template. And in this case, it's a library template. So we'll just call this libtemp for library template. And again, looking for security best practices settings. Okay. And again, you can say more information here. So when you're defining the template, what you're going to do is look at the specific libraries. So you can either name each library, or if you have a naming convention, you can do that. So obviously private data resides in your HR application. So we'll say that any of the libraries beginning with HR are going to be included in this template. And again, you can both include and omit items. So when you're looking at libraries, the obvious thing that you would be wanting to keep in compliance are things like who should be owning this library, and whether or not the library is secured with an authorization list. We'll say no for the library, or none for the library, and again, the public authority setting. So I'm going to say use for the libraries and no private authorities. Okay, now if I only wanted to look at the libraries, then this is all I would have to define. But if I want to look at the objects in the library, so specific files or maybe all of the physical files, then I create this thing called an object template. So I'm going to look at that. And again, best practices, right? So we're going to look at the master file here. And we're going to make sure that that specific file is public exclude. So I'm going to name that specific file. I don't need to put in an attribute or a library if I don't want to. And I have a very specific thing that I want to have, so it needs to be owned by the same owner. S2K object own. And in this case, I have an authorization list that I want to use, HR auth list. Okay, whoops, there we go. And I want the public authority to come from the authorization list, so I'll point that. And I want to make sure that there are no private authorities directly on that file. So that's one thing I'm going to look at. Okay, another thing maybe that I would want to look at, maybe I want to look at all the rest of my files. So I'll say all other files. Okay, and type of file, and really I'm only interested in this case of making sure that my physicals and my logical files continue to be set to my security best practice setting. Okay, so maybe I have a different authorization list for that set of files. So I can do that. If I only want to look at my files, I'm done. But I can do things like make sure that programs adopt, or maybe I don't want them to adopt. So when you put in an object type of program or service program, you get in the policies, you can state the adopted authority settings. So in this case, we'll say that it shouldn't adopt. Use adopted authority, yes. All right. And now again, just like the user profiles, we can run a compliance check on this. And so again, we can run this from this interface directly, or we can, so we'll just do it this way, or we could run the check command. We can schedule that and run it that way. We'll just run it interactively like this. Okay. Now let's look at the result of running this compliance check on another template here. I've just clicked on the name. It brings it up. This case, we were looking at libraries beginning with the letters JD. So these are the three libraries that it discussed. Discovered. We can see that the create authority value was out of compliance in this case. Kind of strange there. If we open it up, there should be some objects in here. There we go. And we can look at the details. Okay, so this one is out of compliance because in this case, the programs were supposed to adopt and they weren't. So again, how does this relate to security best practices? Well, in this case, the adopted authority settings really come from how you have architected your security of your application. So if the users are supposed to get sufficient authority to run the application through adopted authority, then your programs are probably also going to adopt. So you would want to make sure that they stayed that way. And in this case, this is modeled after upgrade their products, they tend to wipe out all of your security settings. Set your settings to security best practices have been lost in that case. So you would want to use PolicyMinder to reset them. I'm just going to do a voice check. JD, am I still on?
Yes, you are. Thank you for checking.
Oh, yep, I can hear you.
You're good. We're having a great session.
All right, is
Carol?
that better? Yes, is that better now?
I think we're fine.
Okay, Thank you. Sorry about that. Just had a little bit of a hiss going on, and I wanted to make sure that I was still there. Okay, so again, from a security best practices, confidential data needs to be denied by default, but not all data has to be denied by default. So don't assume that security best practices is stating that everything has to be denied by default. It may be sufficient that the data be read-only, and so if it's non-confidential data and if all of the users on the system are allowed to see that data, then not a problem leaving it at use. But when you leave data at public of change, that allows or provides the authority for anyone on the system to be able to modify that data from outside of the application, and that's where you fall out of compliance with security best practices. Now when it comes to the IFS, you can do the same thing that you've done for libraries, only with directories. And so when you're looking at the IFS, what most people have on their system is one or two directories where files will be created into the directory by one process and perhaps read out of it by another. So you can have a process or you can have a template that checks the authority to those that directory structure. Okay, and again you can say with the policy, oh, I have to put in a valid path. So you can say what the policy is supposed to be, and again you can run regular compliance checks. Now I refer to reports a lot of times, so let me make sure that I can show you the reports before we go. Let's generate the, let's see, the print policy, okay? So again, remember the user profile where we had the inactive, so it was inactive 90. There we go. Add that selection, and again, if I wanted to, I could email this to myself. I'm just going to submit that and run it so we can take a look at it real quickly here. Okay, so let's take a look at the reports, and I loved this view because again it saves you time. What this is doing is manifesting a view of the IFS where our reports are, and when you have multiple systems, all you have to do is open up these reports and you can see the reports for that system as well as the one that you're on. So it's really a handy way to be able to look at that. So if we look for the print policy that we just generated, inactive 90, here we go. I'll make this less of an eye chart. So this is where the discussion is of why you have omitted or whatever you decided to put in that policy description. Get about a half a page worth of information, but this is documentation of the policy that you have just implemented. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do. When you run a compliance check, you generate a report. So one of the things that you can do, let's see if I can find one of those. Let's just look at the system value report. So when we look at the system values, this one was running a compliance check, and in this case it was looking at the password maximum length, and that's what was out of compliance. So you can see that when you run a compliance report, what will be included are only the items that are out of compliance. We do exception-based reporting. Again, we don't want you to lose the details of the item that's out of compliance by having to sort through things that are normal behavior or in the right state. So we make sure to only list the things that are out of compliance. So in this case, the policy was supposed to be 10, and the value was actually 9 for the maximum length. Now what will happen if everything is in compliance, so if all of the system values in this case would have been compliant, the only thing that you will get in the report is one page. So it's this one-page report. It says what was checked, the fact that everything was in compliance, and the date checked. Again, from a best practices point of view, your auditors want to know that you check these things, everything that we've been talking about. They want to know that you are checking those things on a regular basis. So what you can do is archive the reports that are generated by the compliance check, and you can prove to your auditors that you have checked these things on a regular basis. So the frequency. That's the next question I'm going to get. That really depends on your policy and your auditors and your comfort level with the things that you think may be changing or changing quickly. So for example, we have people that I know check the authority settings on their PCI files twice a day. They have scheduled a compliance check twice a day for that specific file. We have people that are looking for new profiles with all object on a daily basis. We have some people who look for system value changes on a weekly basis and authority changes on a weekly basis. So it really depends on the criticality of the file. One of the things that I didn't show you, but one of the attributes that you can check when you specify a file in an object template is whether or not that file is journaled. We have some of our customers that check that on a daily basis because they want to make sure that journaling hasn't been turned off on specific files. So again, it really depends on what your needs are. But the point here is that it is configurable so it can match your requirements. Now finally, just an ease of use item that I will point out is that when you do have multiple systems, the easiest thing to do is to define one of your systems kind of as a master system and then use the function that we have called import policies. And so you can keep your base set of templates on one system and then import multiple systems, or especially library authorities between your production system and your QA system that need to be the same so that testing is accurate. All of those things are made templates to the other system and not have to recreate those. On implementing security best practices. We've talked about how risk best practices as compared to for IBM I. We have talked about PolicyMinder for IBM I and how you can maintain those security best practices using the various aspects of PolicyMinder. If you have questions, we would love to hear them, and if you don't get to them today, then you can always send us a question through info@skyviewpartners.com. And with that, I'll turn it back over to JD.
Okay, thank you everyone. If you do have questions, we do have just a couple of minutes. So let me show you a couple other screens while you might be going to type your questions into the GoToWebinar dialog box. Again, like Carol said, if you don't have an opportunity to type your question in today or think of a question later, please go to our website at skyviewpartners.com, contact us, and we'll be happy to help you that way. Briefly, let me also go to SkyView Partners can help with software solutions that Carol showed you, Risk Assessor. If you need to compare to best practices, one of the great benefits of Risk Assessor is that it has already gathered best practices for you. So taken a huge job and put it into a very small solution for you. PolicyMinder, Audit Journal Reporter, and PolicyMinder for AIX. We also have been doing a lot with our services offerings, the Security Checkup, which is where we go through the reports with you and give you our observations and recommendations. New, just announced today, SkyView's Managed Services for Compliance Reporting, where critical compliance issues are monitored and you are notified if something falls out of compliance. So if you want SkyView to help monitor that with you, we certainly have the ability to do that. As well, if you need to consider re-architecture or remediation services, we'd be happy to discuss that with you and work out a statement of work. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Carol. This was a great presentation.